The heart is the pump of the cardiovascular system. It's actually a double pump. We have the right pump and the left pump. The right pump pumps blood to the lungs for gas exchange, and the blood returns back to the left side of the heart. This is known as the pulmonary circuit. The left side of the heart pumps the blood to the body for gas exchange, nutrient and waste exchange, and then the blood returns to the right side of the heart. This is known as the systemic circuit. This is a closed system. Right side pumps to lungs, returns back to the left side of the heart, which pumps to body, which returns back to the right side of the heart. The heart weighs between 250 and 300 grams and is about the size of your fist. It's located in the tissue between your lungs known as the mediastinum. One side of the heart rests on the diaphragm. The heart is a little more to the left. It's not right in the middle, so it's about 2/3 to the left of midline. The base of the heart points towards your right shoulder, and the apex points towards your left hip. So as we see the heart in the chest cavity, you can see that it lies more to the left than the right. It lies between the second and fifth rib, and right here on the left side between the fifth and sixth rib is where you can feel or hear the apical pulse. As we look at this cross section of the body, you can see that the heart is trapped between the bony sternum and the vertebra. This is why chest compressions will work. As you push on the sternum, the heart is pushed back against the vertebra. This will compress these chambers, forcing blood out of them. When you release the compression, the chambers will open back up and blood will flow into them. By constantly doing this, you can keep blood circulating in the body for a while. The heart here is shown resting on the diaphragm, the apex, and the base. You can see that the left lung has only 2 lobes because the heart takes up a little more space on the left side of the chest cavity. The heart is covered by a pericardium. The fibrous pericardium is a loose-fitting, tough sac that surrounds the heart. Because this makes one of the closed body cavities, there is a serous pericardium. The parietal layer of the serous pericardium lines the fibrous pericardium. Then it folds back on itself to cover the heart, making the visceral layer. Between the two layers is a little bit of pericardial fluid. This acts as a lubricant between the layers so that as the heart beats inside this sac, there is no friction. You can think of a serous membrane as being a little bit like a deflated balloon or ball. If you were to stick your fist into it, you would have the outer wall. The inner wall would cover your fist directly, and there'd be a little bit of space between the two. That's how the pericardium works. The fibrous sac surrounds the heart loosely, but the serous pericardium has the parietal layer right up against the sac, then folds back on itself to cover the organ. That's the visceral pericardium. This space is where the pericardial fluid is. The membrane can become inflamed, in which case we have something called pericarditis. Here the fluid gets very thick and sticky, and so the heart does not move freely inside the pericardium, and you will be able to hear the movement of the heart against the pericardium as something called pericardial friction rub. If the fluid becomes excessive, or if there's bleeding into the pericardium, you can have cardiac tamponade. This buildup of fluid compresses the heart, so when the heart contracts, it can't rebound and refill. This means that the heart cannot pump blood effectively. The heart itself has 3 layers. The outermost layer is the epicardium, which is actually the visceral layer of the pericardium. The muscle layer is known as the myocardium. This muscle is held together by fibrous connective tissue, which makes the heart very strong. The endocardium is the smooth endothelial lining of the heart. This is only 1 cell layer thick. If we look at a little bit of the heart, where it's attached to a blood vessel here, we can see all of those different components of the pericardium and the heart wall. So here is the fibrous pericardium, and then here is the serous pericardium, the parietal layer, the visceral layer, and that space between the pericardial cavity where the pericardial fluid will be. The visceral pericardium is also known as the epicardium. Then we have the muscle layer, and finally the smooth single-celled endocardium that lines the chambers of the heart. The heart has 4 chambers. There are 2 atria, and that's a plural. Atrium is a singular. So there's a right atrium and a left atrium. The atria are the chambers that receive blood from the blood vessels. Under the atria are 2 ventricles, a right ventricle and a left ventricle. The ventricles are the chambers that discharge blood into the attached blood vessels. So as we look at the heart, we have the right atrium, the left atrium, the right ventricle, and the left ventricle. The heart has 4 major blood vessels attached to it. Attached to the right atrium are the inferior and superior vena cava. Attached to the left atrium are the pulmonary veins. There are actually 4 pulmonary veins that empty into the back of the left atrium. The right ventricle has attached to it the pulmonary trunk, which is an artery. And the left ventricle has attached to it the aorta, which is the largest artery in the body. Looking again at the heart, we have the superior and the inferior vena cava, and they dump directly into the right atrium. Here is the pulmonary trunk, or the artery, that exits the right ventricle. The pulmonary veins come into the back of the heart and empty directly into the left atrium. And then the aorta exits from the left ventricle. It's tucked up under here, so it goes out here and comes out there. Additionally, there are 4 valves associated with the heart. There are 2 atrioventricular, or AV valves. On the right side, the AV valve is called the tricuspid valve. On the left side, the AV valve is known as the bicuspid valve. This has to do with the number of flaps that are associated with the valve. There are 3 flaps on the tricuspid valve, but only 2 on the bicuspid valve. The bicuspid valve is also sometimes called the mitral valve. The 2 semilunar valves, we have the right one, that's the pulmonary semilunar valve. It's the doorway to the pulmonary artery, or the pulmonary trunk. And then we have the left aortic semilunar valve, which is the doorway to the aorta. So looking at the heart again, here is the right AV valve, or the tricuspid valve. And here is the left AV valve, the bicuspid valve, or the mitral valve. The pulmonary semilunar valve is between the right ventricle and the pulmonary trunk. And the aortic semilunar valve is between the left ventricle and the aorta. Valves prevent backflow. This closed circuit works only if it's a one-way flow. So the valves will allow blood to flow through them, but when blood tries to go backwards, the valves act to close up and keep the blood from going in the other direction. Now the chordae tendineae are these little fibers, and they're attached to papillary muscles that sort of anchor the ends of those flaps so that the blood cannot force its way back through the valve. This keeps that one-way flow of blood going, even though we have changes in pressure that may try to force the blood backwards. If the valves don't work, if they're incompetent, then blood will bubble back through the valves, and this can be heard with a stethoscope as a murmur. One cause of incompetent valves is valvular stenosis. These valves should be nice and flexible, but if they become stiff or thickened, then they won't close completely, and you may have a murmur. The coronary circulation is how blood flows to the cardiac muscle. There are 2 major arteries, the right coronary artery and the left coronary artery. These come directly off the base of the aorta. There are typically 2 major branches of the left coronary artery, the anterior interventricular artery, also known as the left anterior descending artery, or the LAD, and the circumflex artery. There are typically 2 branches of the right coronary artery, the marginal artery and the posterior interventricular artery. So if we look at the blood flow, here is the aorta, and here is that left coronary artery coming right off of it and the right coronary artery coming right off of it. The left coronary artery has this anterior interventricular, or the LAD, that comes down. Now branches from this are going to feed the right ventricle and the left ventricle walls on the anterior surface. These are pretty major chambers of the heart. Failure to get blood here and cell death occurring here is a pretty major heart attack. This is sometimes called the widowmaker because if there's a blockage in this artery, the heart attack is pretty much always fatal. The circumflex artery goes around to the back side of the heart. Branches from it will feed the left atrium and the left ventricle. From the right coronary artery, we have this marginal artery that runs down the lateral side of the heart. It helps feed the side of the heart and a little bit of the anterior of the right ventricle. And then you have the posterior interventricular artery that wraps all the way around and comes down the back side of the heart. And this takes care of the posterior side of the right and the left ventricles. Now you'll notice that there are all of these little cross hatches here, these little areas where it appears the blood vessels reconnect with each other. These are called anastomoses, and these are little detours from the blood. They're little alternate circulatory paths. The arterial supply of the heart will vary from person to person. For example, about 15% of the population have their anterior and posterior interventricular artery come from the left coronary artery. It is possible to have both a right and left marginal artery. And the number of anastomoses varies from person to person. The anastomoses give you collateral circulation. And if you have a lot of anastomoses, you're likely to survive blockages of your major blood vessels. If a major blood vessel to the heart gets blocked and you have a natural anastomosis, then the blood can flow alternately and still get to the part of the muscle that the blood should be blocked from. When they do bypass surgery, they're making artificial anastomoses. They're simply going around the area of blockage to reconnect the blood supply on the other side of the blockage. The blood from the arteries flow into the capillary beds of the myocardium, but that flow is not constant. It's intermittent. When the heart contracts, the capillaries are closed. Also, when the heart contracts, the semilunar valves are open, and because of the location of the aortic semilunar valves, when they're open, they're actually blocking the entrance to the coronary arteries. So blood will only flow to the myocardium when the heart is relaxed. The blood is collected from the capillary beds by the cardiac veins. The great cardiac vein, the middle cardiac vein, and the small cardiac vein all empty into this area called the coronary sinus, and the coronary sinus dumps directly into the right atrium. Then there are a couple of small anterior cardiac veins that also empty directly into the right atrium. Angina pectoris is just a word for chest pain. This can occur if there's a reduced blood flow in the coronary arteries as a result of either a blockage of an artery, a very temporary blockage, or some sort of spasming of the arteries that reduces blood flow. This deficiency of blood to the myocardium can cause ischemia, damage to the tissues, but not outright death to the tissues. These are the people who typically have nitroglycerin tablets with them. Nitroglycerin is a potent vasodilator, so when they feel the chest pain, if they take a nitroglycerin, pop it under their tongue, then their blood vessels will open back up, and that will relieve the pain and minimize the damage to the heart. The reason they put this under their tongue is there's a rich blood supply of capillaries under your tongue, so the medicine goes more directly into the bloodstream. A myocardial infarction, or an MI, is when there is a prolonged blockage and the cells actually die. Because cardiac muscle is incapable of repairing itself, the damaged muscle tissue will be replaced with fibrous connective tissue. This will keep the heart intact, but this fibrous connective tissue is not functional, so the heart no longer pumps blood as strongly as it once did. Just as a refresher, the right side is going to receive blood from the tissues and pump it to the lungs. This is your pulmonary circuit, this pumping it to the lungs and bringing it back from the lungs. The left side is going to receive the blood from the lungs and then pump it to the body. This is your systemic circuit from the heart to the body back to the heart. We need to know how blood flows through the heart. We always start with the inferior and superior vena cava. You could start anywhere, but this is a good place to start because that's blood coming back from the body being delivered to the right atrium. When the right atrium contracts, blood will be forced through the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle. When the right ventricle contracts, blood will be forced through the pulmonary semilunar valve and into the pulmonary trunk, which will branch to the right and left pulmonary arteries. This blood will be taken to the lungs where it will get into the capillary beds and we can exchange carbon dioxide for oxygen. The pulmonary veins will return blood from the lungs back to the heart into the left atrium. When the left atrium contracts, blood will go through the bicuspid valve or the mitral valve into the left ventricle. When the left ventricle contracts, blood will be forced through the aortic semilunar valve into the aorta. The aorta will deliver blood to all of the arteries of the body, will break down into the little capillary beds of the tissues, and will have the exchange of gases, nutrients, and waste products. The capillaries will drain back into the veins of the body, and the blood will return via the inferior and superior vena cava back to the right side of the heart, and we will start all over again.